So hi, I'm Liz Marlowe. I teach in the art department and also in the core program. I teach core Legacies of the Ancient World, and I also have created a new minor at Colgate in museum studies along with my colleagues in the art department as well as anthropology and history. So I want to talk to you today about this quite interesting object, this hand-painted scroll that was purchased on a trip to India that was taken by a group of faculty, 27 faculty members, in 2012. We were all faculty members who teach in different aspects of the core curriculum, and we came together. Our then President Jeffrey Herbst got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, which paid for this quite wonderful 2-week trip to India that brought us all together to have a whole series of conversations about the relationship between the past and the present, modernity, science, technology, the relationship between science and culture, and a whole range of issues that touch upon the basic themes of Colgate's core curriculum. For me, one of my favorite moments on this trip was when we went to the Deli Craft Museum, which is an unusual museum in that it contains both a kind of historical collection of crafts and art objects made all over India, but it also has a component sort of outside the main building. There's a whole separate area where they have invited artists and craftsmen and artisans from all over India to come and stay at the museum and do a kind of artist residency there. And so they are on site making their objects, making their crafts, and then also selling them directly to museum visitors. So when our group went to Delhi, we were sort of circulating around this back area, and I was quite struck. I saw one of my colleagues also observing a woman who was standing in front of a whole series of painted scrolls, like the one I'm standing in front of now, but instead of talking, she was standing there singing quite beautiful, moving, kind of sad, mournful songs. So I went over, I joined my colleague, and we had a pretty extensive conversation with her about the artworks that she produces and what these songs are. It turns out this is, I learned from her, this is a rich tradition that's practiced primarily in the region of West Bengal. It's a practice that goes back to the Middle Ages and possibly even older than that, where family groups organize themselves in units where there'll be one family member who is a composer of songs, somebody else will compose the lyrics, and then there's an associated member of the family who is responsible for representing the song in visual form. So these are kind of family clans that create these songs and then a visual image that goes with them. And then another member of the clan will have the role of being the kind of itinerant bard who travels around to religious festivals and performs these songs in festivals that are sometimes competitive, where these itinerant bards will all gather together and perform their music. They're also always religious festivals, so this is a way of honoring the gods. And the topics of these songs and the scrolls can range from kind of the very traditional, going back to the Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. This woman had a number of scrolls that illustrated episodes from those epics, but there were also some that told about more recent episodes in history. So she had a scroll that was narrating the sinking of the Titanic. There was another one that told the story of India's struggle for independence. She had a couple that dealt with the events of 9/11 in the United States. So a whole range of genres that are being translated into these traditional song painting performances. So this image is telling the story of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, right, which started as an earthquake off the coast of Indonesia, was a massive tsunami that traveled all the way across the Indian Ocean and killed about 250,000 people all on one morning in 2004. So this is an image of that very tragic event, and you can see the way the artist is creating a narrative out of that kind of fundamentally incomprehensible event. It starts with this large image of a very fierce-looking deity at the top of the screen, and you can see waves of energy radiating out of his head, and then he reaches down with his arms into the human realm, right, and kind of literally manipulates what's happening down on Earth with these hands and these frightening pointy fingernails. Then the bulk of the image is taken up by this watery scene where you see bodies floating in the water here. We get some kind of crocodile or sea creature. Here in the middle of it, one of my favorite details, we get an anthropomorphic helicopter, so a helicopter that has a sort of human form in the front, probably meant to be understood as a deity. This helicopter is coming and rescuing people out of the water. Here on this side we see here, and then down here we see television reporters with their cameras trained on the event, watching what happened. And then in between the reporters, we actually get scenes inside people's homes where you see people sitting around watching the events unfold on their television. So we see it sort of simultaneously happening in the real world, and we see how that real world event was experienced by people who watched it in their homes. Then down below, there's an image of a benevolent water god who we're supposed to understand is under the sea and who is protecting or sort of taking care of the deceased people who've come to join her in their watery graves. And the imagery around the border with this floral pattern, my colleague in the art department, Padma Kaimal, has suggested this kind of floral motif may be meant to indicate a kind of regeneration that is possible after a tragic event like this. So I really like to use this when I teach Legacies of the Ancient World, the component of Colgate's core curriculum that I teach in, because I see all kinds of interesting parallels here with the work of the poet Homer. Probably wasn't a single poet, probably a whole number of people who performed these Homeric poems. But what I am struck by are the similarities in this tradition of oral poetry and using oral poetry and a kind of freely adapted tradition of oral poems that were probably handed down over many generations, using this kind of storytelling tradition to make sense of incomprehensible human tragedies, right? Events like the Trojan War or the tragic events of a soldier trying to return home after a Trojan War, or in this case, a tsunami that kills 250,000 people, right? In both of these cases, we see cultures that probably have a very strong tradition of oral poetry and storytelling. These are cultures with relatively low levels of literacy, so the tradition of handing on their history from generation to generation was carried out through this kind of oral poetry, and also where there's a corpus of traditional stories that are getting freely adapted and probably creatively rearranged and mixed and matched every time a new singer tells that story. I also like the way that both Homer and this storyteller frame this very human tragedy in terms of humans' relations with the gods, right? Both in Homer and in this story, we have the gods literally framing the action at the top of the scene and at the bottom scene. So making sense of an incomprehensible tragedy in terms of the relations between humans and their gods. So it's another way that I use this event to get my students to think about what Homer is trying to achieve with the epic poems that we read in Core 151, Legacies of the Ancient World.
And some of the closer shots too.
How much does that cost?
9,000.
9,000.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you go? Yeah, Di is filming.
সাংবাদিকের দল